Here is a question that sounds almost like a trick question, but isn't. What did humans actually eat before they had fire? The honest answer involves a surprising amount of raw meat. A genuinely impressive variety of insects, several categories of food that would horrify a modern health inspector, and a digestive system that was, by necessity, considerably more robust and considerably less picky than the one you are currently using to process your lunch. Before fire, eating was not the controlled, predictable, relatively safe activity it is today. It was a constant negotiation with raw biology, bacterial risk, mechanical difficulty, and the simple problem of extracting enough calories from foods that had not yet been chemically transformed by heat into something easier to digest. So let us actually walk through what was on the ancient pre-fire menu, why it looked the way it did, and what this reveals about a period of human evolutionary history that gets dramatically less attention than it deserves. Mostly because it happened before the invention of the one technology, cooking. That makes for such a satisfying before and after story.
Let us start with the single most important point to establish before anything else.
Fire is, in evolutionary terms, an extremely recent addition to the hominin toolkit, relative to the deep timeline of our lineage. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Our broader genus, Homo, stretches back close to 3 million years. But the controlled, regular use of fire, not occasional opportunistic use of natural wildfires. Fire is, in evolutionary terms, an extremely recent addition to the hominin toolkit that appears to have become widespread and consistent somewhere in the range of 400,000 to 1 million years ago, with some evidence suggesting earlier sporadic use, but genuine debate over how routine and widespread that early use actually was. That makes for such a satisfying before and after story. Stretching back millions of years before any consistent fire use, our ancestors were eating an entirely raw diet, and were doing so not as some kind of survivalist novelty, but as the only available option. Generation after generation after generation. Let us begin with meat, because meat consumption is one of the most heavily discussed and most consequential dietary shifts in the entire hominin evolutionary record, and it happened long before fire entered the picture. The archaeological evidence for meat consumption among early hominins predates controlled fire use by an enormous margin. Cut marks on animal bones, produced by stone tools used to butcher carcasses, appear in the archaeological record at sites dating back at least 2.5 million years. And some evidence pushes this date even earlier. This means hominins were eating meat, raw meat by definition, since fire was not yet in routine use, for well over 1 million years before they had any way to cook it. What did raw meat consumption actually involve, practically speaking? The honest answer is that it involved considerably more chewing than modern humans are accustomed to. A genuine and persistent risk of parasitic and bacterial infection.
And a digestive system specifically adapted to handle these challenges in ways that modern human digestive systems have partially lost.
Raw meat is mechanically tough. Muscle fibers, connective tissue, and cartilage in uncooked meat require significantly more chewing force
and significantly more time to break down into swallowable portions compared to cooked meat, where heat has already begun the process of breaking down collagen and softening muscle fiber structure.
This is part of why early hominin skulls show such robust jaw musculature. The mechanical demands of processing raw, tough food required genuinely powerful chewing apparatus that later softened anatomically as cooking gradually reduced these mechanical demands. The bacterial and parasitic risk associated with raw meat consumption was genuinely significant. Modern food safety guidelines exist precisely because raw and undercooked meat carries meaningful risk of pathogens,
including various salmonella strains, E. coli, listeria, and numerous parasitic organisms,
all of which are substantially reduced or eliminated by adequate cooking temperatures. Early hominins eating raw meat were exposed to all of these risks without any of the modern interventions. This raises an obvious and genuinely interesting question. How did early hominins survive this level of exposure to foodborne pathogens for millions of years?
The answer appears to involve hominin gut physiology, including stomach acidity levels, being somewhat more aggressive in its pathogen-killing capacity than is strictly necessary for a cooked food diet.
Fire is, in evolutionary terms, an extremely recent addition to the hominin toolkit.
The second, and this deserves real emphasis, hominins almost certainly suffered genuinely significant rates of illness and mortality,
directly attributable to raw food consumption, and simply survived this burden as one of many mortality risks. Beyond raw meat, early hominins almost certainly consumed organ meats with particular enthusiasm. Organ meats, liver, kidney, brain, marrow, are considerably softer and more mechanically tractable than muscle tissue,
requiring far less chewing effort to consume raw, while simultaneously offering extremely high concentrations of specific nutrients. Bone marrow deserves particular attention because the archaeological evidence for marrow extraction among early hominins is genuinely extensive. Many cut marks and percussion marks found on ancient animal bones are specifically consistent with deliberate bone breaking.
This means hominins were eating meat, raw meat by definition, since fire was not yet in routine use. Marrow is essentially pure fat, calorically dense, and would have represented an extremely efficient source of concentrated calories for a species working with a raw, unprocessed food supply. There is also a genuinely interesting strategic dimension to early hominin meat acquisition,
because a substantial body of evidence suggests early hominins, particularly in the earlier phases of the genus Homo, may have relied significantly on scavenging.
Accessing carcasses that had already been killed by other predators.
This scavenging strategy has specific implications for what was actually being eaten. Since scavenged carcasses range from relatively fresh to genuinely well into the process of decomposition,
Many scavenging species, including hyenas and vultures, regularly consume meat well into advanced stages of decomposition without apparent harm. And the practical reality of a scavenging-dependent diet almost certainly meant that at least some portion of the meat being consumed was considerably less fresh than what any modern person would willingly eat.
Now let us turn to the plant side of the pre-fire diet. Because plant foods almost certainly represented the bulk of caloric intake for most hominin populations. The specific challenge with raw plant consumption involves the digestibility of starch.
Many of the most calorically dense plant foods available to early hominins, tubers, roots, and various underground storage organs, contain starch in a form that is significantly more difficult for the human digestive system to break down when raw compared to when cooked. Raw starch exists in a crystalline structure that human digestive enzymes have considerable difficulty accessing efficiently.
Cooking disrupts this crystalline structure through gelatinization,
in which heat and moisture cause starch granules to swell and rupture, exposing far more surface area to digestive enzymes. Studies comparing the caloric yield of raw versus cooked starchy foods have found substantial differences. Marrow is essentially pure fat, calorically dense, and would have represented an extremely efficient source of concentrated calories.
This raises an interesting evolutionary puzzle that researchers have spent considerable effort addressing.
Bone marrow deserves particular attention because the archaeological evidence for marrow extraction among early hominins is genuinely extensive.
Several mechanisms appear to have been involved. First, mechanical processing short of actual cooking does provide some genuine benefit. Pounding, mashing, and thorough chewing increases surface area exposed to digestive enzymes.
Second, fermentation, whether deliberately managed or simply an inevitable consequence of plant foods left in warm conditions,
provides another mechanism for improving digestibility without fire. Third, and perhaps most important, early hominins almost certainly relied more heavily on plant foods that did not present the same raw starch digestibility problem.
Fruits, when ripe, contain sugars in forms directly absorbable without enzymatic breakdown.
And nuts and seeds contain fats and proteins that do not face the same digestibility gap.
This suggests the pre-fire hominin diet likely emphasized fruits, nuts, seeds, and leafy plant material more heavily relative to starchy tubers and roots
than the post-fire diet eventually did. The specific challenge with raw plant consumption involves the digestibility of starch.
Insects represented an extremely accessible, reliable, and nutritionally dense food source.
These tiny insects play a huge role in the ecosystem of this vibrant green leaf. Look how they move.
Comparative studies of contemporary great apes, particularly chimpanzees, document extensive and sophisticated insect foraging behavior. Termites, ants, grubs, and various beetle larvae would have represented a reliable, year-round, easily accessible source of fat and protein.
That required no fire and relatively modest foraging effort relative to the caloric return.
Honey deserves specific mention as well because it represents one of the most calorically dense and most immediately accessible food sources available,
requiring absolutely no processing to be consumed and digested with full efficiency.
The challenge with honey was not digestibility, but acquisition. Given that wild honey is typically defended by bees in ways that make extraction genuinely risky, there is a specific anatomical line of evidence worth exploring in more depth.
because the human digestive tract itself preserves a kind of physical record of this entire dietary transition. The human gastrointestinal tract is, relative to body size, notably smaller than that of our closest living primate relatives. This reduction in human gut size is widely interpreted as a direct consequence of cooking.